Chapter 4. By the summer of 1985, many residents of San Salvador had convinced themselves that the worst was behind them. The war still raged in the countryside, ambushes on rural roads, military operations in the mountains, the grinding violence of a conflict with no clear front lines. But inside the capital, something had shifted. Businesses stayed open later. Restaurants were full. Families ventured out after dark. The city had decided, or was trying to decide, that it had turned a corner. It was a comforting belief. It was also wrong. On the evening of Wednesday, June 19th, the 6 Marines assigned to the embassy gathered at the Marine House after finishing their shifts. The kitchen had prepared dinner. Someone lifted the lid off the serving tray. Liver and onions. Sergeant Bobby Joe Dixon stared at it and shook his head. "No chance," he said, laughing. "This is a third-world country. We don't know whose liver that is." The room erupted. Greg Weber leaned back in his chair. "I'm not risking that." Someone suggested the Zona Rosa. No one argued. Less than an hour later, they were outside Chili's, settled at a table on the open terrace with drinks in front of them and the sounds of the district moving around them, music from the neighboring restaurants, traffic on the boulevard, conversations from nearby tables bleeding together in the warm night air. The city felt safe. It felt like an evening with nowhere particular to be. Anton noticed a familiar face seated nearby. "Hey, Jim," he said. "That's Rob Hindle." Hindle worked in the embassy's tactical communications unit and was sitting with 2 women, including Sandra Castro from the visa section. "Tell the guys to order beers and nachos," Anton said. "We'll be right back." Hindle waved them over. "Sit down," he said with a grin. "I'll buy you a beer." The conversation drifted from embassy gossip to Marine Corps stories. Around them, the district remained alive with activity. Nearby, 2 American technicians from Wang Laboratories shared dinner with a Chilean engineer and several Salvadoran professionals celebrating a birthday. Waiters threaded through the crowd, balancing trays overhead, while music and laughter filled the night. No one paid much attention when 2 white Toyota Hilux pickup trucks pulled to the curb outside Chili's. At first, there was no reason to. Armed men in pickup trucks were a common sight in El Salvador. Soldiers conducted patrols and identification checks throughout the city, particularly among young men of military age. A pickup truck stopping outside a restaurant hardly seemed unusual. The vehicle idled for a moment. Then the doors opened. Several young men stepped out carrying M16 rifles. For a brief second, most people still assumed they were soldiers. Then one of the men turned toward the Marine's table and raised his weapon. "Viva la Revolución!" The words hung in the warm night air for a fraction of a second before the first burst of gunfire shattered the illusion of peace. Anton turned toward the sound, already thinking somebody had set off fireworks. The thought never had time to finish. Automatic rifle fire exploded across the terrace. The sound hit with a force he recognized immediately. Multiple rifles were firing in rapid succession, their sharp reports echoing between the restaurants and drowning out every other sound in the district. Marine training took over. He knew that sound, knew the rhythm of automatic fire. Before his mind had fully processed what was happening, his body was already moving. The first rounds tore into the Marine's table. For a moment, nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Diners stared toward the street in confusion as glass shattered overhead and bottles exploded across tabletops. Then the screaming began. People dove beneath tables. Chairs toppled onto the pavement. Waiters dropped trays and ran for cover. Jim Lane disappeared from Anton's sight almost immediately. Sandra Castro collapsed beside him, frozen with fear. Anton grabbed her by the arm. "Listen to me," he shouted over the gunfire. "See that doorway? Crawl to it. Do not stand up. Crawl." She nodded frantically. Anton waited for a slight pause in the incoming fire and pointed toward Mediterranean restaurant only a few yards away. "Go!" Sandra and the other women began crawling across broken glass toward the entrance. Anton turned toward the civilians still trapped on the patio. "Move!" he yelled. "Everybody inside!" The command finally broke the paralysis. People scrambled toward cover as bullets ripped through hanging plants and shattered ceramic pots suspended above the terraces. Inside Mediterranean, the situation felt only marginally safer. The restaurant's large bay windows faced directly toward the street. Anyone firing from outside had a clear view into the dining area. As rounds cracked through the windows, dirt, pottery fragments, and fern leaves sprayed across the floor. Anton immediately saw the problem. One determined gunman could walk directly to those windows and kill everyone inside. "Is there a back room?" he asked Sandra. She pointed toward the rear of the restaurant. "Get everybody back there, away from the windows." Sandra began shouting instructions in Spanish while frightened patrons crawled toward the storage area behind the bar. Anton remained near the entrance. Outside, the attack continued. The gunmen moved methodically between Chili's, Flashback, and Mediterranean. Witnesses would later describe them firing in controlled bursts rather than blindly spraying the crowd. Several directed fire toward the walls surrounding the Brazilian ambassador's residence across the street. Others concentrated almost exclusively on the Marines. Anton spotted the bartender. "Do you have a weapon?" The man stared at him. "No." For a moment, Anton could hardly believe it. During his time in El Salvador, it often seemed as though everyone owned a firearm. "Fine," Anton said. "Where's the light switch?" The bartender pointed toward a dimmer mounted on a pole near the center of the room. Keeping low, Anton crawled through broken glass as rounds snapped through the windows above him. Reaching the switch, he jumped, slapped it downward, and dropped back to the floor. The restaurant vanished into darkness. Near the bar, another man crouched behind a counter holding a 9mm pistol. "I'm Lance Corporal Kossuth," Anton said, "Marine security guard." The man kept his eyes fixed on the entrance. "Don't get in front of me," he replied calmly. "If somebody comes through that door, I'm shooting." Outside, the gunfire rolled through the Zona Rosa in deafening waves. At one point, a civilian near Chili's drew a handgun and fired toward the attackers. The guerrillas immediately shifted their rifles toward him. The response was devastating. Moments later, additional shots rang out from somewhere above the restaurants, possibly from the roof area. One of the attackers suddenly spun and collapsed into the street. Whether he had been struck by return fire or accidentally shot by one of his own companions was never conclusively determined. The surviving gunman dragged him away while continuing to fire. Inside Mediterranean, Anton reached for his embassy radio. The channels were chaos. Local guards, embassy personnel, police, and emergency responders all seemed to be talking at once. Voices overlapped until the transmissions became nearly impossible to understand. Anton took control. "All local traffic moved to channels 1 and 2 immediately," he ordered. "Marine communications switched to channels 3 and 4. Clear the net." Gradually, the confusion eased. "This is MSG detachment," Anton transmitted. "We have 4 Marines down, multiple civilian casualties. Send ambulances immediately." Even as he said the words, they felt impossible. 4 Marines down. The phrase hung in the air. Outside, the gunfire finally began to diminish. In its place came something worse. The cries of the wounded. People called for help in both Spanish and English. Others shouted names. Some simply screamed. Anton looked toward the doorway. "I've got to check on my Marines." The man with the pistol shook his head. "Don't." "I have to." Keeping low, Anton moved toward the entrance and looked outside. The scene barely resembled the lively restaurant district that had existed only minutes earlier. Tables lay overturned across the sidewalk. Smoke drifted through the humid night air. Broken glass covered the pavement. Bodies were scattered among fallen chairs and shattered dishes. Then he saw Tom Handwork. Tom lay face down near the terrace. Anton crawled to him, uncertain whether the attackers were truly gone. Tom still had a pulse, but the wounds were severe. The evidence suggested he had been shot from extremely close range. Nearby, Patrick Kwiatkowski managed to speak. "Help me!" Anton moved toward him. "Hang on, Pat. Help is coming." As he assessed the scene, the nature of the attack became increasingly clear. The gunman had not simply opened fire and fled. Evidence later indicated that after several Marines had fallen, at least one attacker moved closer and fired additional rounds into wounded victims at near point-blank range, while the other guerrillas maintained security around the perimeter. Greg Weber, despite suffering devastating wounds, attempted to crawl toward safety. Witnesses reported that the attacker followed him and fired again. Bobby Joe Dixon lay near the front of the restaurant suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Anton could see immediately that the injuries were grave, though he could not yet know their full extent. Then, through the smoke and confusion, he spotted Jim Lane. Alive. For the first time since the attack began, Anton felt a small measure of relief. He grabbed his friend. "My God," he said. "I'm glad you're okay." The attack had lasted only minutes, though for those caught inside it, the passage of time felt distorted. When the surviving gunmen finally withdrew, they loaded their wounded companion into the pickup truck and disappeared into the city. Security personnel near the Brazilian ambassador's residence fired after them as they escaped into the darkness. When the shooting ended, 13 people lay dead or mortally wounded across the Zona Rosa. The wounded guerrilla would later die after being abandoned at a Red Cross facility. The Marines never made it to the hospital alive. For San Salvador, the illusion was over. The war had found the capital again. Chapter 5. The morning after the massacre, the Zona Rosa looked exhausted. Employees from the restaurant stood silently beneath the early sunlight, washing blood from the sidewalks with hoses while shattered glass scraped beneath their shoes. Black mourning ribbons hung from storefront entrances along the boulevard. The hanging plants outside Mediterranean drooped under bullet holes and broken pottery, while workers quietly turned overturned tables upright again, as if normal life might somehow return if they simply kept moving. Nothing about the district felt normal anymore. Inside the American embassy, the atmosphere felt heavier still. The Marines moved quietly through the compound while radios crackled in the background. Sleep came only in short stretches, if at all. Some remained awake for nearly 2 days, because every time they closed their eyes, they found themselves back on the terrace. The sudden burst of gunfire, the smoke hanging motionless in the warm night air, the screams, the bodies lying among overturned tables beneath the patio lights. The Marine house no longer resembled the place it had been only the day before. The music that usually drifted from someone's room had stopped. The televisions that carried ball games and the easy arguments about sports and future assignments, all of it had gone quiet. The building felt drained of something that could not easily be named and would not quickly return. The Marine Corps rotated embassy assignments regularly in part to reduce complacency and counterintelligence risks, but also because life at an overseas post could be psychologically demanding. Although embassy duty often appeared prestigious from the outside, much of the work consisted of repetitive security posts, long hours, and the constant awareness that political violence could erupt with little warning. Marines endured those pressures through the friendships they built with one another, which made the losses suffered in Zona Rosa feel deeply personal throughout the embassy community. The men killed in Zona Rosa had not simply been co-workers. Embassy duty forged relationships of a particular closeness because Marines assigned overseas had no one else. They stood watch together through long nights, trained together, traveled together, and spent nearly every waking hour in each other's company while serving in countries most Americans would never visit. The losses suffered on Boulevard del Hipódromo were not the abstract losses of men known by name and rank. They were the losses of friends whose habits and voices and particular ways of filling a room were known completely. Each of them had come from somewhere. Each had chosen this. Greg Weber grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, The kind of city that produces athletes the way river towns produce them, quietly, without fanfare, through youth leagues and school gyms and the accumulated discipline of showing up. He graduated from Elder High School in 1981 as a member of the National Honor Society and president of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a combination that told you something essential about him. The physical confidence and the moral seriousness existed in the same body without contradiction. He ran cross-country. He worked extensively with the Big Brother program, spending time with underprivileged kids who needed someone older to show up consistently. He set a goal of finishing first in his Marine Security Guard class and accomplished it in February 1985, 4 months before he died. He felt he was needed most in El Salvador and had been stationed there since March. Anton Kossuth remembered standing beneath the pull-up bars during physical training behind the embassy compound in the humid Salvadoran heat. Weber had already completed 20 dead-hang pull-ups when Anton called out to him. "Come on, Weber, grab the top poles and do another one." Weber looked back over his shoulder with mock betrayal, as if Anton had just driven a knife between his shoulder blades. The Marines laughed. Then Weber reached above the pull-up bar itself, grabbing the top poles with both hands and forcing himself upward again. "This one's for you, Kossuth," the Marines shouted. Another pull-up. "This one's for my mom." The laughter grew louder. Then Weber grinned through the strain. "And this one's for the Marine Corps." When he finally dropped from the bar, the Marines around him erupted. Anton never forgot that moment, because it captured exactly who Greg Weber was: strong without arrogance, competitive without cruelty, confident without ego. A man who had tutored struggling kids in Cincinnati and then shipped himself to one of the most dangerous diplomatic posts in the hemisphere because he believed he was needed there. "That guy was just badass," Anton would later say quietly. "I loved Greg Weber." Thomas Handwerk grew up in Boardman, Ohio, a working-class suburb outside Youngstown, where his parents still lived. He graduated from Boardman High School in 1979. His parents later recalled that his only real trouble in school came when he skipped a class. Not to skip out, but to go to the library to read literature on the Marine Corps. The institution that would eventually define his life had found him long before he found it. He enlisted shortly after graduation and never looked back. He had served difficult assignments before El Salvador. Marines still joked about the Adak stare he brought back from his tour in Adak, Alaska, that distant look men acquired after too many months in isolated places surrounded by endless cold and darkness. Sometimes Tom would stare quietly at nothing in particular for long stretches, lost somewhere far away. But when work started, nobody in the detachment was more squared away. His locker looked inspection-ready at all hours. His uniforms were immaculate, boots polished, gear perfectly arranged. He had served with 1st Battalion, 4th Marines at 29 Palms, and then completed embassy duty in Hamburg, West Germany, before arriving in El Salvador in March. By then he understood that Marine Security Guard duty was not simply about carrying a rifle. Inside an embassy, a Marine represented the United States itself. Handwerk carried that understanding the way he carried everything else, naturally without making a production of it. He also carried quieter ambitions that the uniform didn't show. He was interested in fine arts. He had always wanted to write a screenplay, an Errol Flynn adventure, swashbuckling and grand, that he imagined the president might star in. He felt that Reagan had a special relationship with the men and women of the armed forces and had always wanted to meet him. He never got the chance. Instead, on a tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base 3 days after his death, Ronald Reagan came to him. He had been engaged to be married. Her name was Deborah Tratner. Patrick Kwiatkowski came from Wausau, Wisconsin, a paper mill city in the central part of the state where winters arrived early and stayed long and young men found ways to fill the time. He graduated from East High School in 1982, where he had been a dedicated altar boy at the local Catholic parish and an amateur boxer, a combination that surprised no one who knew him, since both required the same thing: showing up, absorbing punishment, and refusing to quit. He loved fishing. He loved snow skiing. He joined the Marines immediately after graduation because he wanted to be the best, and because he intended to use the GI Bill to go to college when his tour was finished. He had attended MSG school at Quantico alongside Bobby Dixon as part of Class 3-83 and later served at the American Embassy in Nairobi before his assignment to El Salvador, arriving only 2 weeks before the attack. He was 20 years old. He talked constantly about his girlfriend, who was flying in the following day to teach English at the American school in San Salvador while they built a small life together during his posting. The Marines teased him about it without mercy. "Pat's settling down," somebody announced at the Marine house. "Shut up," Kwiatkowski laughed back. He would have turned 21 the day before the ceremony at Andrews, June 21, 1985. His sister Babette Ambrise, who attended that ceremony, was 9 months pregnant. She planned to name the baby Patrick if it was a boy. Bobby Joe Dixon was from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he carried the place with him the way Southerners often do, in his speech, in his standards, in the particular code of conduct that defined how he moved through the world. He graduated from Tuscaloosa High School in 1975 and enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1979. He had previously served as an embassy guard in Guatemala City before his assignment to El Salvador, which meant he had already spent time in one dangerous Central American posting and volunteered to return to another. He didn't have to go. He chose to. He was an athlete, a baseball pitcher with the kind of arm that earned him a reputation back home, and a devoted follower of University of Alabama football, which in Tuscaloosa was less a preference than a religion. His family remembered him as a man who almost always had a smile on his face, someone who genuinely enjoyed helping people who had less than he did. He pushed the younger Marines under his care hard, because he believed the standards of the Corps were not suggestions, and that discipline was the only thing standing between a Marine and a mistake that couldn't be undone. Anton Kossuth was the youngest in the detachment, and Dixon stayed on him constantly, about physical training, about weight, about the gap between where Anton was and where a Marine of his rank should be. "He thought I was kind of a screw-up," Anton later joked. "I felt like the youngest kid out of 9 brothers and sisters again." But he never hated him for it. He understood even then that Dixon was pushing him because standards mattered, and because in a country at war, the difference between sharp and sloppy could become the difference between alive and dead. Bobby Joe Dixon was 27 years old. His favorite song was Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, released the summer before Das, a song about a man coming home from a war his country had already moved past, wondering what he had given it and what it had given him back. Dixon never got to hear how it ended for the man in the song. He shipped to El Salvador before the album finished its run on the radio, and he never came home. The civilians who died that night carried their own unfinished lives into the Zona Rosa. George Vini and Robert Alvidrez had traveled to El Salvador for Wang Laboratories, part of the rapidly expanding computer industry that was reshaping global business during the 1980s. They were businessmen, not soldiers. Dr. Humberto Sáenz Ceballos had spent his life teaching students at Universidad Dr. José Matías Delgado, engineers, lawyers, and Salvadoran professionals, whose names never received the same international attention as the Marines, but whose families suffered the same loss, filled the surrounding tables that night. None of them expected the war to arrive at their table. And for the Marines who survived, the hardest part was not simply witnessing death. It was returning afterward to a Marine house filled with the specific, irreplaceable presence of men who had been alive only hours earlier. Weber grinning through impossible pull-ups, handwork standing squared away in every circumstance, Kwiatkowski laughing off the teasing about his girlfriend, Dixon riding the younger men because he loved the Corps and believed they could be better. Then suddenly they were gone, and the house that had been too loud was now too quiet, and the quiet was its own kind of violence. The kind that doesn't announce itself with gunfire, that simply settles in and refuses to leave.